Good evening. My name is Drew Thompson, and I am an associate professor of visual culture and Black Studies here at the Bard Graduate Center. Welcome to this evening's convening of the series Faculty in Focus, which explores the topic of Polaroids as objects of Black material culture. Polaroid cameras and their instant color developing technology revolutionized photography in the mid-20th century. However, little is known about the complex role that Polaroid films and cameras played in African and Black diaspora histories. The Polaroid Corporation prided itself on employing African Americans as scientists, janitors, photographers, and secretaries. Yet the ways that these Black workers contributed through their labor and expertise to the development of the technology remains untold. Some of these workers organized themselves in the early 1970s to form the Polaroid Revolutionary Workers Movement, one of the first anti-apartheid movements organized in the United States around photography and its representation of Black people. The movement uncovered that Polaroid was selling equipment to the South African government, who used the technology to make passbooks that separated populations according to race. Despite the company's bad business practices, Black Americans continued to purchase Polaroids during the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, and used them to make family albums and picture scenes of everyday life. And for reasons that still remain unknown, even to this day, Polaroids are some of the only films that populations incarcerated in the United States have in their possession. Polaroids are interesting as objects of Black material culture when you look at them through the lens of Blackness, especially because of the ways in which they touch on so many aspects of what it means to be Black in America and across the diaspora, including protest, fashion, beauty, and incarceration. For me, questions arise about how Black labor and activism contributed to the Polaroid Corporation's development of instant colored photography, and about the varied yet complicated uses of photography within Black life, ranging from the everyday to conditions of incarceration. This evening, we have invited the photographer and social practice artist Zun Lee and the poet Dawn Lundy Martin to consider the topic of Black sociality through writing and image-making practices. This event is not intended to offer up definitions for a term like Black sociality, but instead envisioned as a form of collective practice and meditation, involving the human senses of listening, seeing, and perhaps even speaking to experiences that may only be felt. Part of this process entails sharing how each of us became introduced to one another and experimenting with how to read images of and made within the context of Black sociality. Rather than doing the customary introductions where I share biographical information about each speaker, I thought I would introduce first Zun Lee by a short story about how I came to know his work. Then Zun will come up to the podium and speak to his work with Polaroids, and afterwards we'll introduce Dawn Lundy Martin, who will share her own poetry and experience with her own family's Polaroids. Afterwards, there will be a moderated discussion in some space for audience engagement. In winter 2018, I first met Zun Lee at the Bronx Documentary Center, where he was having an exhibition titled Father Figures, exploring alternate notions of Black fatherhood. I was at the start of a burgeoning and yet soon failing career as an art critic. I had proposed a review of his exhibition to the publication Arts Black because it was the only outlet interested in a review of the topic Black fatherhood that I found so compelling. Upon entering the gallery, I was immediately moved to almost tears because of the ways in which Zun's pictures spoke to my own childhood. At the same time, the exhibition allowed me to envision myself as a Black father, images that Black youth are often deprived of. Zun traveled and lived within different families, carefully selecting the moments to document, whether the car ride home after a long day or playing in the bedroom. One gets the sense from the photographs, the delicate line that Zun traveled and navigated, but the ability to see what counters more documentary images of Black men is so compelling and needed. While making work that featured in the Father Figure series and other documentary projects, Chun found Polaroids literally on the streets of Detroit. Soon thereafter, he found Polaroids for sale on the website eBay. With the aim of creating an archive of lost images, he purchased the Polaroids from a dealer in Los Angeles, California. He would later upload the photographs to social media platforms like Instagram and Facebook, in addition to creating an online database. The facial recognition software associated with Instagram connected Lee with the photograph sitters. Many of the people Lee met online did not want their images returned. If anything, they preferred digital copies. For Lee, it became apparent that Polaroids had the ability to reenact trauma for those people separated from their images. He stated back in 2018 at our first meeting, and I quote, "What does it say that people can't keep their images?" End quote. Displacement characterizes scenes of Black life represented in the Polaroids that Lee has organized or did organize under, I think, the initial title, Fade Resistance. Lee often refers to Polaroids he has collected as, and I quote, "enough," end quote. Certain bonds become possible and apparent through the displaced Polaroids, for example, between the incarcerated and not incarcerated. Lee's project opens another means to tend to Black life through color and to previously unconsidered modes of photographic practice that inevitably fueled and sustained Black Americans' use of Polaroids despite the company's trafficking in surveillance technologies. To such an end, Lee's project introduces the following question, and I quote, "What does it mean for someone to lose an image of themselves or not want an image of themselves?" End quote. The loss of Polaroids is as probable as its deterioration. So without further delay, I welcome Zun Lee to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you for this loving, if rather abrupt, introduction. First of all, thank you for coming out. I know this is a time during the week when all of you probably have other things worthwhile to do. So thank you for prioritizing this meeting over whatever else you could have easily filled your time with, and I appreciate your presence. Speaking of presence, this is my first time back in New York since 2020. I've traveled to other places, but New York used to sort of be where I focus a lot of my work, and so yeah, this feels strange but also familiar, and it's great to see some familiar faces and friends here among the audience. So yeah, if things turn south, let me know, and hopefully you'll carry me. But I wanted to, in the spirit of today, not make this about photography. I mean, all of my work is about photography, but not so much about objecthood and making of objects, but more so making of meaning and sense making. And in that context, when we talk about this ephemeral work and the ephemeral notion of Black sociality, what does it mean when Black people come together, gather, and the images that happen as a consequence of such gathering? What is it that we're after? What is the conversation that ensues, and what is the Dawn and I often use the word ineffable to talk to, that often remains unnamed when we simply look at images and discuss the visuality of images. And is there something else that we can uncover by engaging with images, not just by looking, but in other ways, right? And so I hopefully can have that conversation, not just with my interlocutors, but with all of you today. As mentioned, Drew mentioned that I collected these for about 10 years. And it's gotten to a point where I had to figure out, they were crowding my home, and I needed to figure out, so I can't keep them in my home. They're also decaying. There's a time factor here. What's next? Do they need institutional care? I cannot keep collecting them and not having a strategy of what to do with the materiality, but also the visuality of it, right? So eventually, the Art Gallery of Ontario acquired the collection with the aim to have public programming and a show. And in so doing, we hit the pandemic, and we also realized that simply displaying and archiving this kind of collection isn't really doing this work justice, that we also need to animate this collection, not just with conversation and with institutions subsume under community engagement. And we can talk about what it means when a white settler organization has to belabor this word, community engagement. But also just what these images themselves mean when they're housed at an institution where they actually don't belong, and how such belonging can at the same time, inspire a conversation about like sociality in spaces that are expected or unexpected. And so hopefully today can be such a space for us today. We released a catalog for the show that finally happened a few months ago at the AGO pertaining to this work. And the AGO has also committed to continuing this work of engaging audiences around the collection. So this is a work in progress as it is meant to be. And so hopefully I can encourage some of you to join us in this work of progress, even through your own scholarship, through your own pedagogy. I wanted to read a bit from my essay, and the essay actually starts with two references. The book is not really a catalog, right? It's really meant to be a gathering of friends. So I've invited some of my friends to help me with putting this book together. And one of my friends is the writer John Keane, who teaches at Rutgers. And he actually, I found a poem that he had translated by a Cuban poet named Jesus Coscase, and then he actually translated this work into English, and I wanted to kind of invite him to read, even if virtually.
This is John Keane reading Looking at Photos, Mirando Fotos by Jesus Coscase. Looking at Photos. Dagmaris walking away on the beach. Asuncion, her tan, her trim dew. Gloria 2 days before dying. Roberto pointing to nothing. Idermis behind Oscar after Jorge. I so far away I almost cannot make myself out. My brother wasting a smile. My aunt as ugly as the word itself. Grandmother in her best days. Grandfather with a festive tie. My father drunk again. My mother like a distantly spilled perfume. Mirando fotos. Dagmaris alejándose en la playa. Asunción, su abanico, su penado breve. Gloria 2 días antes de morir. Roberto señalando nada. Y Dermis detrás Oscar, después Jorge. Yo tan lejos que casi no me distingo. Mi hermano gastando una sonrisa. Mi tía fea hasta el fondo de la palabra. Abuela en su mejor tiempo. Abuelo con un capato contenta. Mi padre embriagado otra vez. Mi madre como un perfume derramado distante.
That last line kills, right? But more so, even though this poem is titled Looking at Photos and it's deceptively simple, why this works for me is like we're actually never looking at photos, right? Like we actually don't need to look at the photos that Jesus is looking at for us to feel the presence of his family members, or to feel the connection, and maybe even feel how we are ourselves connected to some of our own memories around family, right? So we don't see a single picture, and we rely on Jesus basically, and his ability of world making and storytelling and sort of this poetic inhabitants that he creates here to kind of tell us how he feels about his family. Some of the people that he loves, some people that he maybe doesn't love so much, and the mother, right, like a distantly spilled perfume, right? So the other senses that are invoked, not just by looking, but by feeling what it means to be family, and also some family that are no longer around, right? And so I chose this poem to kind of encourage us to kind of invoke other registers beyond the visual when engaging with photos, and why that is an important part of how this collection is supposed to work. And to that extent, he's another friend of mine who actually couldn't come today, but sends his regards, Fred Moulton, who teaches at NYU. And this is just a line from one of his poems, which I found kind of epitomizes some of the work I've done with these Polaroids, right? And it's basically an excerpt that goes, "Here go a box with a lid on it. If you open it, you can come into our world." What I've actually done is literally walk around for 10 years with a little box of Polaroids and kind of engage people in conversation, right? And not so much about the objecthood or visuality, but like using them as catalysts for people to share their own stories in an almost autoethnographic way, right? By looking at these, feeling like you have permission to share a vulnerable part about yourself and why those images might matter to you. And so, again, this notion of the box, or shout out to Aaron's story box, right? And what the work of a story box does in a cultural context, but also in a context of cultural erasure and displacement. People sort of read this line as also very innocuous, right? Oh yeah, so I have permission to look at this? No, not necessarily, right? There's an invitation that's being extended. You can open this box and come into a world, but you still have to do the work. The invitation is not necessarily a permission, right? And so do the work of opening the box and engaging, and you can discover what it is to be us and how we have a sense of our world, right? And so this kind of invitation and what this invitation means is what hopefully we can convey to you today. That went a little south, but okay. So I kind of drew a line through the title just to say, okay, we're just making this a gathering of friends. So I would like for all of you to be invited to feel like you're joining a gathering of friends, right? And like any gathering of friends, some tend to become very talkative. So feel free to stop me if I do become too talkative. But I wanted to share a story that I had written about in the catalog, and in a slightly abbreviated way. And hopefully, I often don't read it because it seems a little much, but I actually used the story to do my friend's story justice. So I'm going to ask you to indulge in this reading, if you don't mind. This is a friend named CJ who passed away in 2021. And when he passed, his mother, who didn't like me, sent me a box of his belongings that he wanted me to have. And so this piece is in dedication to my friend and his box of belongings. The title of this essay is A Whole Mess and a Half, The Matter of Most. I had recently received a box of everyday belongings that my friend CJ, we used to call him Toots, had wanted me to have but never had a chance to send. Toots had passed away in 2021, and his mother had mailed this inconspicuous cardboard box with a customs value declaration of $15. No note or letter came with it. I recognized that box immediately and vaguely recalled its contents. It took me a while to muster the courage to unpack and open it. Among many U.S. Army soldiers stationed in my hometown of Frankfurt, Germany, that were part of my inner circle, Toots was my ride or die, the kind of companion you are fortunate to have one or two of at any point in your life. In German, we'd say Toots was jemand, mit dem man Pferde stehlen kann, someone with whom you could go steal horses. In the hold of Toots' sparsely appointed barracks room, which was really just a partition space in a larger hall, we dreamed up a whole universe of otherwise possibility, as Sean Crawley would say. Toots and I would spend hours listening to albums produced by Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis in the signature Minneapolis sound. The SOS band was one of our favorite groups. Toots would also share stories of a magical place called Paradise Garage in New York City. He would read me works by a poet named Essex Hempel out of a chapbook he had just published named Earth Life. And he would tell me stories of a wondrous city named Atlanta that he suggested I move to. I did end up moving to Atlanta in 1995, and that's another story. Toots' box of improvised, mostly handmade curios contained, among other things, a rusty, accurate keychain he had remade into a bracelet by adding a strap, a dreadlock he had saved after shaving his head when he joined the military, little ribbons cut from an old t-shirt and stapled to small branches of pussy willow to make Easter ornaments, a small plastic bag filled with cherry moya seeds, a fruit that he had often mentioned, but I actually personally hadn't tasted until 2019. Old Polaroids of him and his other half, Virgil. So that's Toots, and Virgil, who he introduced to me as his boyfriend, he never was. But that's the story he told us, right? And so that's the story I'm conveying to you. An old birthday card that said, "To tune your whole mess and a half, never change, love, toot toot." And a vinyl LP label he had drawn for an imaginary music album he had always dreamt of producing. The label said, "Flight Time Productions, Taboo Records, the earth has music for those who listen." Some of you might remember this label. And again, the earth has music for those who listen. This poignant motto really invites many readings when you think about it, in terms of what matters most. Sonic entanglement as study, listening with care or as care, instructions for care for those called upon to respond, which really means anyone, collective cultivation versus cultural production. And my engagement with these objects as I received the box and opened it continued as if it had never been disrupted. Through registering their scent and touching the objects in the box, I didn't just sink back into a kind of nostalgia, but I actually became that person from back in the day. Has that ever happened to you when you open a box of, something precious and it doesn't just take you right back, it almost makes you revert back to that person that you were. And so that, I want you kind of to sit with what that means. Because the experience brought back to me what my 10 years of practice of collecting these Polaroids really was about, that when we can touch something by opening that proverbial box, it's really a world-making activity, a poetic of shared dispossession through dislocated images, not a practice of looking at images, just like the poem, right? And world-making as a practice of feeling really calls us to sit with some of the harder questions that we all kind of lived a version of, right? What can be crueler than the act of gazing at material evidenced of personhood reduced to detritus and subjectivities denied and dislocated? But what can be more affirming than sharing in a Black aliveness that refuses to be discarded, even if the material circumstances were? An aliveness that cannot be contained, indexed, or cataloged, and that even if or because it was produced through something horrific, never answers to the horror itself. None of Toots' objects were actually meant to be kept in the box. Toots used them, wore them out, and the value attached to these objects came from not an act of preservation, but his use and his suggesting that I should continue using them when I received them. And just as Toots did not discard anything or abandon anybody he cared about, that little box he left didn't just signify an open invitation. It came with instructions for careful use to add and extend my care onto these objects by using them as tools to build the otherwise we had always imagined. And in this recognition of this shared but also irredeemable care of hapticality reproduced in the hold that, causes us to be moved from look at something to feel with something and feel together with us. I feel that's what we need to do, and we must actually engage with collections like this in that way, not as an imposition or by way of a permission that can never be granted anyway, but in the recognition that Black sociality refuses capture, even in images, and thus can neither be reduced or boxed in. Sitting with the ineffable does not equate to being imprecise about how we feel about it. We can sustain a space where being and becoming can thrive, not in response to negation, but as an affirmation of undercommunal entanglement. We can gather to try and figure some things out, and that gathering or that opening of the box requires an orientation towards risk. World making isn't pretty or, can sometimes be downright ugly and problematic or messy, as this title of my work suggests. But messy doesn't mean we don't care. We care deeply and demand to be cared for deeply. And much like Toots' memorabilia, the collection is also a tool for world making that demands to be touched and used. But herein lies also the double paradox of this collection, right? That the need for institutional archival preservation of the Polaroids that continue to decay, that very active preservation and institutional care also removes them from our ability to touch them and to use them. And further, such communal use and touch cannot be upheld where it actually needs to manifest the most, in the Black homes where this practice actually lives. And, an institution had to be invoked to provide that kind of custodial care, which is actually evidence of something larger at work that really needs to be examined. When it comes to this kind of notion of care, I'm actually inspired by Audre Lorde's exploration of feeling and world making in her essay "Poetry is Not a Luxury." Similar to her deliberations on the erotic, Lorde invokes feelings not as idle fantasy, but as loci of hidden sources of power, and poetry as a transformational tool to express into knowledge the revelation or distillation of experience. And I quote, "Poetry forms the quality of the light within which we predicate our hopes and dreams towards survival and change, first made into language, then into idea, then into more tangible action." And to that end, I love Kevin Kwashi's reading of Lorde's poetry as illumination in his book Black Aliveness, or Poetics of Being. And I quote, "The manner and sensation of how we pay attention to our being constitute our being itself." And I'll repeat that. The manner and sensation of how we pay attention to our being constitute our being itself. How we feel makes who we become, who we are, right? That world making isn't just about something else or something other. It's also a remaking of who we are by engaging with this kind of work. And I feel, the question of, is there a better way to sit with these Polaroids and their leakage of scent and pigment and light and story? And considering this dislocated archive as a haptic rassemblage, if you will, not accessed via aesthetic considerations, but in reclaiming our capacity to become ourselves. And then allowing this force to move us into action, to mess ourselves up into the kind of life that instantiates our imagination into a new reality. So that's all I have in terms of unpacking everything I said in a singular image, looking but feeling and gathering and becoming through, this sort of entanglement. And speaking of entanglement, I actually want to turn the mic over to my, I should say, dear friend, who I want to share a story around how we met. So when we sat with the AGO to think about the catalog and who should we invite to write, and we had a Zoom meeting with Fred to, kind of ascertain, whose voice do we need. Fred actually kind of, in a very Solomonic way, suggested 3 people, right? He said, "I know 3 poets. I'll send you all 3 poets' work, and you pick the one that resonates the most." And, Dawn was among the 3. And he also sent her essay, "When a Person Goes Missing," right? Which you had which you had written about in a very personal way about your own family story around police brutality and, quotidian violence. But what resonated right away is that Dawn didn't just write about something; she writes herself into something, right? And so for us, this act of, lovingly but caringly, but also stridently writing yourself into your own story, and then sharing that story with us, so that we might also write ourselves into our own stories. We felt that this was what these Polaroids needed: this kind of care that isn't about appropriating or writing over, but writing with and sitting with. And so I hope you all get a dose of Dawn today. And looking forward to having you speak today. Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for inviting me. Chun, I love you and I love your mind. And it's been just like a pleasure to get to know you and your work these past years. So I always appreciate the invitation, being here with you, and being in this unique collaboration between image and text, right? So what I'm going to do is, y'all can hear me, right? Am I supposed to point this like this? Yeah, I'm supposed to point it like this. You can hear me. So I wrote this essay, and then I wrote these poems after looking at all of the Polaroids that were collected in the exhibition. And then when they were published in the book, it got really weird, right? Because the way that, so this is the book, What Matters Most, and the way that, I like the way that they happen in the book, because like it kind of estranged me from the work in a way, I think that's what happens sometimes in collaboration. You turn something over and suddenly You're like, what is it now? Um, and that's what happened for me with the poems, because the way that the poems appear in the book is that they appear like across the book. You'll have like a bunch of images of Polaroids, and then you'll have a poem. Then you have like a bunch of images of Polaroids, and then you'll have a poem. And the way that I really imagined them working was like all together in conversation, right? So I'm going to give you a little bit of that conversation today, and they kind of follow from the essay. So I'm going to read a little bit of the essay, which is titled Black Aliveness in Flight. And I'm going to go right into the poems. The other thing that I'll say is that these poems are constantly becoming new things, right? And so in the new book that I'm writing now, they have I'm reworking the poems for this new context, and so you'll get to see or hear a little bit of not the original necessarily, but this weird revision, which is still in conversation with the original. Right, you follow? Okay, so I'm going to get into it. I don't have much time up here, I know. Okay, Black Aliveness in Flight. So I'm going to start in the middle of this essay. It starts with an epigraph by my friend, the artist and poet Ronaldo V. Wilson, who says, Black aliveness as sane, wild, alert, infinite, and forever. The magnificence of being at once intensely familiar and entirely alien. I ain't been where you been, but I know what you know. A great many of the photographs in this collection exhibit a kind of wholesomeness of Black family life, holidays, just born babies, family reunions, graduations, people and new cars, snapshots of everyday life. A woman lies on a sofa talking into a red telephone receiver. Two middle-aged men play cards on Thanksgiving 1985. A father gives his son his first haircut in the kitchen. A girl in a white dress sits at a white piano. Even cool cats, you dig, sign photos to dad with love. Like all worthwhile archives, this one refuses wholeness, but instead points us toward what's outside of the frame and its corners, off-center, what's missing and what's singular. It's in these fissures, peripheries, and striking singularities where one might glimpse what I think of as a Black understanding. In one photo, actually, I wish this photo was up, but it's not. I don't think it was ever going to be up, but I wish you could see it. You could see it if you have the book. I'm going to describe it the best I can. In one photo, a fit young man stands naked in front of a row of bathroom sinks and mirrors. The top arch of his bare ass is visible. His muscular back draws our attention toward the vertical dip of his spine. Although he's facing away from the camera, we see his face in the mirror, taking in both the photographer and the viewer outside the frame, us. He leans on one of the sinks in the space, which appears to be either a barracks or a locker room. His mouth is parted rather seductively, as if caught not entirely by surprise in his birthday suit. What strikes me about the photo is how the double image, what the mirror reflects and what the mirror image itself approximates. What the mirror reflects and the mirror image of itself approximates the complicated notion of Blackness. Oh, good gosh. Let me read this sentence again. It's a long one. What strikes me about the photo is how the double image, what the mirror reflects and the mirror image itself, approximates the complicated notion of what Blackness might be if Blackness were something that could be named, foreclosed, known. A kind of ars poetica for the collection, this image untangles the role of the Black subject from its tight historical knot and examines the role of snapshot instant photography in undetermining that role. The image invents itself. As Leslie Marmon Silko writes, quote, a photograph is a passageway and some photographs are dead ends. Then this photograph is a knife slicing the passageway open so that we encounter a pitch in the visual frequency and become unsure of our footing. In Tina Camp's lexicon, frequency is a term used to account for the impression images leave on us, their impact, and how they move us. The term also has to do with, as Camp notes, the rate at which something occurs, its vibrational frequency. The visual frequency in the case of Lee's found collection of Black life photographs matters as a gesture toward the vibrational impact of how we're able to visually metabolize the volume of images. There are thousands, right? A fluttering overwhelms the sensorium. A fluttering mystifies any relationship between the object and the gaze, even if you are the object of your own gaze. Does it, the object, fly away? After wind was water. After we were water, when water subsumed, when the thing that was, water, when our arms were water, our gestures flower, our gestures bloom, when it was, when we were, when water was not, when we subsumed water, when we shivered into, there's a last word to that poem and it occurs in the book. It's flame, but I took it out. So the poems in their original incarnation are shaped like a photograph. They're in these little justified text, blocks of text, and they're untitled. They're a kind of reading across the photos. And the way that I got to them is that I would just kind of go through the slide after slide after slide after slide, and just, sit with the images. And then I would take a nap, and then I would get up and lie on the floor. And then from the floor, I write down some words, kind of in that state between sleeping and dreaming and waking. So this is how these poems happen, I'll tell you. No one weeps a day's décolletage plunges us into what desire leaves in the wake of a radiant abyss. Black light, oxymoron of our being. Voluminous shape, any shade of blackness, body. A rose pressed between teeth, this wild intercourse, stillness. I dive into the white frame, my hair alive with a young newness of becoming. JD lighting J birthday cake, candles 1982. Where are we now? How could we know anything else but this textured comforter? Fingers trace its web white cracks, its shadow strains from the wear of existence. Now you enter submissively, bowing to qualities of light, velvet as skin, interiors transport of a strobe light world, the word and imagined form of being, black pose, stray keys come around, smear of dissidence and rolling stones and hand gestures, no nation mask, gaze glimpse out, glimpse gaze out, a counterpoint to Christina Sharp's anti-Black weather. Frame what cannot be captured, what cannot be contained in the tattered corners, Scotch tape residue, what vestiges of water remain untraceable when it's not you and them, but me and them, could be royal, as in we got a dog, how you exit the stage. Mama's straight lean held by snow sky, knee deep in invisible whiteness. The black cockatoo has the most power. Me and them and me, Jay eating meat sticks, ain't that something? The coming into being with company under magnolia tree. Sing with me. Distinctive sensation of one's own vernacular background. Say, no need for the word freedom to account for what this is. Say nest. Say my anchor, my glory, my sister's arm draped around me, worlds in that drape. Monique, just knowing she's so damn fine against red beamer. Somebody's mama's purse like a weapon. Little crib babies not caring. Swift and swag, hats, those collars, white walled tires, penchant for protection, arms woven into cloth, how we do, a sign, a signal singing, no strain at all. If a photo is music, so tenderly it hums. If there is a freedom place inside Sylvia Winters' near total alienation, feel it now. Hang your hat on your hanging hands. Where the sun don't shine, it obliterates. Supposition, fractal, my hirsute maker, my subjectitude. We are not strangers in this strange land. Okay, that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Dawn. And thank you, June. Before opening it up, I thought we could have just a small conversation about our interventions and also kind of maybe draw some connections. Over the course of the faculty series, I've been asking our invited guests to help us think through Blackness through material objects. And I was just wondering to hear from each of you a question that we also asked Simone Brown, an American artist, thinking about what can we or what can be learned from looking at material culture through the lens of Blackness, or what have you learned yourselves about the condition of Blackness through the respective objects that you engage with or the objects that you each produce.
You want me to go first? I can go first. I can start it off. I mean, I don't know. What have I learned about Blackness through my engagement with like Black material culture, visual culture?
Or visual and material culture.
I mean, the thing that I was trying to say, we're playing footsies. The thing that I was trying to say in the essay, really in part is, you know, again, this kind of word estrangement is coming up for me. Like, I feel as if there's an impossibility, even in the visual, in the image, and kind of coming any closer to foreclosing this notion of what we call Blackness. I think that I'm estranged from the term Blackness. You know, the more I read and the more that I think about this category of Black, is it a condition? Mm-hmm. You know, I think we tend to think about it as a, you know, as some kind of visual effect, as inscribed on the body, you know, or is it a social condition? Is it a floating signifier? Is it always attached to the bodies that we call Black people? Like these are the questions that always come up for me, and I don't know if, you know, if material culture, especially the photograph, brings me any closer to a kind of knowing.
Mm-hmm.
is what I'm saying.
I think the difficulty is that a question like this prescribes singularity,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like there is a Black material culture, a Black sociality, and I think even the question kind of eschews a certain answerability, where you know Michelle Wright says not what is Blackness, but when is Blackness,
Mm.
right? And so Blackness, not just as a condition or a deterministic marker for race or ethnicity or certain cultural characteristics, but more so, Blackness is what happens when people who conscribe themselves as Black come together and talk about themselves, right? So the notion of Blackness as an event that can, or as an undercommons that can be conjured up and invoked by those that feel called upon, if you will. But with images, there's always this thing that, as soon as, it's like Schrodinger's cat, right? Like, or quantum physics, as soon as you look at something and you want to nail it down, it escapes whatever the intention is that you want to look at it. So, but I think also that, aspect of always being in flight and not wanting to be nailed down is what makes that Black, right? Like fugitivity. But also the notion of aliveness that, you think you know what this is, you don't know anything. And so what I belabor the most is when we talk, I want to go off in terms of like Stuart Hall and Roland Barthes and codes and, semiotics, but like when you look at Black Twitter and meme culture, right? And people always like think Black Twitter is a thing, or there's a group of people that curates, and it's like Black Twitter is just like Black people coming together and talking about something that animates their desire to talk about something, right? And hashtag it, and then sometimes it just starts off and it keeps going. But people always engage with it in a way that what makes this thing Black that you're talking about, and it's not that what is being discussed, but the fact that Black people are gathering to elevate it to a level of conversation that others are not engaging in, right? So and so, um, and again, it's not about defining what it is, but more so, if people come together and find it important enough to come together and talk about it, this is where this ineffable thing called Blackness resides.
Mm.
Right.
And for our guests this evening, just to let you know, these Polaroids that are going or running behind us are from the collection that Chun has gathered and brought to us, both to think about and to engage with. And you all can't see them, but the audience can somewhat see them. And I guess on this image here, something that I wanted to ask each of you as you worked through the collection, I was struck by the condition of incarceration that animates this space, but often goes unnoticed. Chun, when I was looking through so many of your photographs, I recalled how we are taken into an incarceral space, sometimes quite literally, about the prison. And then, Dawn, when I was reading your writing about some of these images, not only your own family photographs, but some of the others in the collection, I was struck by the subtleties in which that space of the prison also permeates other aspects of Black life. And a question that I selfishly answer, because it's one that I'm seeking to answer in my own research, is that I can't quite understand, despite Black communities in America across these time periods they have a consciousness about the surveillance that they're under, the incarceration that they face, and yet still they embrace Polaroids as a mode of representation. Like these become the means in which they see and document their family lives. And I'm just interested in hearing from you why do that? If what kinds of answers do you have to a question that sort of asks, why do you think Black Americans embrace Polaroids even as they have been used as tools of surveillance and oppression? Yeah, it is.
But it's also, oh, my bad. I mean, everybody has a phone. We all know most of these phones are produced in China. We know the horrific conditions. Chinese factory workers have been put through, interred basically, unable to leave their factories, so we can buy these on time. Right, like through COVID, and even iPhone factory workers rising up and violently resisting the conditions that they were put under. But yet we buy these iPhones, right? So does that mean we're shitty people or we don't care about these workers? But no, it means just it's a little. There's more complexity to the kind of dissonance that we have, right? Like China is really far away, South Africa is really far away, right? Like I'm sure people in the 70s knew of the horrific conditions Black people were under in terms of the South African Polaroid factories and the oppressive regime that put Polaroids to use in terms of the passport policies. But at the same time, yeah, I mean, you use the tools that are available to you to articulate your identity and belonging and communal representation and family bond. So, for me, it's not so much an either or, or is the response to, should we all just throw our phones out, right? Or, so I think it comes down to what are the conditions or the, I don't want to say use case, that sounds too designy, but, in what ways, do Black people recognize their complicity in something? And in what other ways do Black people use the same tools, the master's tools don't dismantle the master's house, and in so knowing, we still want to engage with these tools because we still have to figure out how to get through a day and through a life. And, and so anything we do and use, and by us being basically in the hold and being, surrounded by, capitalism, if you will, we know where these clothes are made. Does it mean we walk around naked? No, right? So we just have to make do with the world that we live in. And while it makes us complicit, it also means that we use the tools that are at our disposal to figure out a way to articulate aliveness in a way that makes sense to us, knowing that maybe there's no real way to escape some of these conditions or escape some of the complicity that might feel. So.
I don't know the answer to that question. But what you made me think about, and what your propositions make me think about, is if there is a condition that we call Blackness, and then it also means that there is a condition that we call disappearance. Writing a lot about disappearance, and jail or prison is a kind of disappearance. If there is a condition called imprisonment, then there's a condition called objection. There's a condition called objection. I mean, then the rules of the game are changed, right? So what the whole nature of the political becomes a kind of a nature of the political that might be not able to be understood in the world of the rational, which is the world in which most of us live most of the time, not all of the time. I mean, one of the reasons that I love poetry is because poetry, when it's good, exists in a different world that is not the rational world. And it may be making sense in a way akin to the sense making that happens when you use an ostensibly repressive tool for other purposes, right? The whole world of it is re-scripted given this illogic that happens to the thing we call the Black body.
Thank you. And I was just wondering if we could speak a little bit about this idea of the aliveness in Black sociality. Particularly, I was struck by the reading of images, both that you and Chun and you, Dawn, do, and thinking about how do we propose or rethink our reading of images beyond just what is in the content of the image itself. And I was really struck by each of you having, the reason I had the thought of putting you guys together in conversation was thinking about the poet and photographer, and how does one make an image, right? Either in words or through the photographic practice. And I was also struck by this idea of the work that you all do is very collective and community oriented. And I was just wondering if you can speak to this process of reading images or going beyond images, and how you kind of think about that.
Especially like the family photograph, right? Or the photograph or the Polaroid or whatever. Yeah. I mean, I'll just say the part I didn't get to because we didn't have the projection. I was going to read from a different part of the essay, but we didn't have the projection. I was going to read from this part of the essay where, while working on this project, the book project, with Chun and the whole team of folks who put this together, I was at home visiting my mother, and I found some old Polaroids in our family album, and I was like, I'm going to write these in my essay so that they'll be in the book, so that they'll be a part of the collection.
And we didn't even ask you.
They didn't ask me. It was kind of like, so that's the part I didn't get to. But what it got me actually thinking about was, I don't know if this is going to answer your question, but like what it got me actually thinking about was, even when a photograph is personal, I'm in one with my cousin, my little cousin, and then there's another one of my dad and his son from a previous marriage, and his son Andrew, and then Andrew's wife. And I was thinking about how what photographs do to memory, and how a reading of a photograph, even when it's familiar to you, it's not like, oh, there's the photograph, I remember it. It's like the photograph it's like a re-memory, right? What the photograph does to memory, or how the photograph like creates memory. And then there's all of this stuff like behind it. And so I was also trying to dig up like what's behind the photographs when I'm actually familiar with it, and how that contributes to the reading. But still, even in that instance, there are all of these kind of knowledge gaps, right? So there's the gaps in memory. So it might be, kind of maybe less gaps in some ways in the reading of a photograph that's unfamiliar to you, because you're aware of the gaps when it's familiar to you, So that's just something that I was thinking about in my reading of my own family photographs.
It's an interesting comment, because you said once that when you looked at your own photos that you contributed, you almost didn't recognize yourself or even the situation, right? So,
yeah, exactly.
And you had to reconstruct even what this scene meant, right? Or even in this context of now using this image as part of this book project, right? So, and I feel like it's actually how individual and collective memory work to kind of construct something like sociality, in terms of who do we tend to gather with to make meaning, right? And who are these people that we call kinfolk? And then how do we recognize these kinfolk in something like a family photo? Meaning, when relationality and sociality gets inscribed or burnt into a photo, and then it is used by somebody else to do a reading, like the poem by Jesus, where he describes a family member, and not just what is in the image, what people are doing, but I really love this person, that person, right? Like, ugly like the word. I was like, right, it's humorous, but also like, a little bit of shade. So, but also, it brings us closer to everybody, right? It's not like we, have an antipathy towards that person now, and that person is more closely connected to us. We just like this sort of slightly tongue-in-cheek commentary, and then this really devastating line at the end, like what was it? The perfume comment, right? Yeah. So, and so this bond that somebody has with a mother, So all that to say that the photo for me is not about or of sociality, but is evidence of sociality surrounding something, right? So we remember not necessarily a photo in terms of like a facsimile reproduction of reality, but and I don't know how many of you have Polaroids of yourself in family albums, right? So, but you don't remember just what's happening. It's like, oh, this is what that person said. This is the food that they ate. I remember you smelled terrible, and I didn't like what you were wearing, right? You remember the whole way that people gathered and made connection happen by way of such a photo, right? And so, for me, that is how meaning travels, right? Like the object might be gone, but in child psychology, we have this idea of object permanence, which isn't tied to the material object, but it's the conversation that surrounds it and the constant process of reinscribing memory and laying sort of palimpsesticity over it. What that memory might mean to another generation that might have not experienced that particular moment, right? And so I feel like sociality articulates itself in that sort of palimpsestic recreation and remixing and re-editing and so on and so forth.
Great, thank you. So in the spirit of being on time, but also allowing for some sociality, I think we'll kind of close here. And if you can join me in thanking our speakers and guests this evening, thank you so much for this conversation, sharing both your collaboration and your work. And thank you to everyone for coming. So we'll close the event now, and then there'll be refreshments outside and space here within the lecture hall for some conversation. Thank you.